Please.
Okay, thanks very much, Ingrid, and thanks, Joe, for inviting me. I was here for the school last year, and I'd say 60 of the 65 papers that were delivered were tremendous, and the same thing again this time, hugely instructive and illuminating. So it's an honour to be part of that, and I hope I can add something to that. Gareth Fitzgerald, in his own inimitable way, told us a couple of weeks before he died that he had written 2,227,600 words for the Irish Times. And among his last words were a two-part article that he wrote in the 6th week and 5th week before he died. And in these two articles, he tried to go to the heart of the root cause of what has happened. He set out to try to define and zone in on really where do we look for the ultimate explanation for what went wrong. And this is what he said. And these are from the two articles. Looking back, our economic and financial failures have a common factor. We lack civic responsibility, deficiencies in civic morality, decline in standards, a defective value system, a deterioration in ethical standards. And the two articles were laced with those comments. Mary Robinson, commenting on television the day of his funeral, said, and looking forward, Gareth reminds us of the values we need to think about more as we set out on the difficult task of rebuilding. So what I want to develop in my contribution today is this, that the root cause of the national crisis was a betrayal of a set of values that are essential to a decent, prosperous society and functioning institutions. This audience here yesterday erupted in spontaneous applause when Averill Power went right to the heart of the explanation for what happened to Fianna Fáil. She said it was a breakdown in ethics and a loss of moral compass, because everybody sensed that was the nub of the issue. And these things are hard to say because you're questioning people's integrity, their morals and their values. And the key to creating a sustainable economy and a decent society, and to reforming and renewing the institutions, including the civil service and the wider public service, is to rediscover and breathe new life into a set of values. And I hope to be able to say something practical about that beyond moralising about it. Values are revealed at two levels you can look at. One is they're revealed at the institutional levels in the culture of the organisation. So it's like a shared mindset, a set of shared values that gels and locks in like a web that is, and we've used the word culture, and I'll say more about that. And the other level is values are revealed at individual level in character, the character of the particular individual. And I'm going to develop each of these. First of all, I showed you a slide last year where I used an iceberg to capture a whole series of editorials and comments on culture. And I said to you, watch from now on, watch how frequently we reach for the construct culture to explain what went wrong. And at the time, I offered a prize to anybody who could match these up. So cover-up and collusion, denial, deference, clericalism, arrogance, greed, perks, violence, irresponsibility, and the 7 deadly sins. And could you match those up with FOSS, the HSE, developers, Gardaí, the Catholic Church, and so on? Now, up until every single week, watch the papers, 2 or 3 times a week. This week, it was Enda Kenny's commentary on the culture of the Roman Church. Dysfunction, disconnection, and narcissism. Emily Logan writing about children. She was saying the guidelines will not work unless we change the culture underlying the guidelines, the mindset of the people to whom the guidelines are presented for implementation. And I could give you another whole 100 examples where the people have zoned in and said the real problem is in the culture. Now, I think we have to break this down. If it's so important and so fundamental, we have to find a way to render it discussable and that we can do something practical about it. With regard to public service reform, Sean made the very accurate distinction between modernisation and reform. Modernisation, frankly, is about the public service and the civil service in particular catching up with 21st century organisation and management. The use of IT, back office integration, flexibility, performance management systems that work, all of this stuff has been in place a decade, and in some cases 2 or 3 decades in the better private sector companies. And in many respects, you know, this may sound harsh, it's frankly no big deal. It's time they got on with it. Now, but reform is a different matter. Reform is a deeper spiritual or ethical system which guides all the above. Now, one of the reasons that change has not occurred above the line is because of the culture below the line. So the culture above the line, modernization is a technical challenge. You can get it on a DVD, you can go to Denmark, for example, and learn what they did. Civil servants have gone to New Zealand to see how things work all over the world. You can get best practice in care pathways, in accident and emergency from the British Health Service. There's no problem with finding best practice and implementing it. That's the technical challenge. It's a developmental challenge to tackle the stuff below the line. Above the line, below the line is about mores is where people say they're all doing it. Morals is about what's right and wrong. Above the line is competence. Now, I thought Matthew Elderfield was really interesting on this, because he said that the people that there were people on the boards of banks and in the senior management positions of banks were going to have to convince them not just of their competence but of their probity. And what he was talking about was not just competence, but character, probity. And he even said he expects court cases in relation to this. So it sounds that he is going to confront the issue not just of competence, but of character. So, all that's in play now in relation to modernisation and reform in the public service, I'm quite certain you'll hear a lot of it from Robert Watt. There's a very impressive programme coming together. But almost everything that's being laid out as needing to be done in relation to reform and modernisation was mentioned in the 2008 OECD report. But what was interesting about that report, again, they have the technical aspects and the cultural aspects. But of the 375 pages in the report, the review of the Irish Public Service, 370 plus pages, were about what I call the technical stuff. All e-government, integrated structure, senior public service, budgetary processes, all that good management stuff. There were only 2.5 pages that mentioned culture. And I met one of the authors of this report a fortnight ago. I shared a platform with him in Dublin. And I drew his attention to this because, as you'll see on my next slide, they attach huge importance to these 3 pages. And I asked him, why did you not spend a bit more time on this stuff below the line, given that it's so important? There's a taboo on it. He said we were warned off it. As outsiders, we were asked, well, what would you know about this? So it's very difficult to go after this stuff below the line, whether in the form of culture or individual character, because it seemed to be somehow offensive to challenge these things. And there is a taboo on challenging these things. And he told me that they were warned off it. But even though they had 370 pages above the line, 3 below the line, here's what they said about it. Back. The OECD report on the public service, achieving an integrated and effective, etc., public service will require mobilising its greatest resource. Public service, its values. Behaviour is less determined by formal sanctions and incentives, bonuses and rewards and sanctions, but by the values that are established in their hearts and minds. This is not me talking, this is the OECD. They stressed the importance of rethinking core values in public service management reforms. They said other governments have found it crucial to restate traditional and new values to provide an ethical framework for staff behaviour. Countries have placed a renewed emphasis on rethinking their core values in public management reforms, and many countries are formalising their core values. So even though they only had a bare mention of it in the report, they're saying this stuff is of the essence. So this is a view from A&E. It's just another illustration. Almost every organisation I go into, this issue is now surfacing of the culture. I have studied 6 in-depth reports on A&E in Irish hospitals. They're given to me as part of a piece of work I'm doing. And these are emails I have from the deputy CEO of one of the big hospitals. And what they're saying is, we know what best practice is in A&E, but the problem is on the cultural and behavioural issues below the line. I've had meetings with two of the most senior clinicians in the HSE, national directors, and again they've said to me, we know what best practice is. We have enough capacity in most cases. We can predict the demand down to the last drunk who'll turn up on a Saturday night, but what we have is chaos within the system, and it's a cultural problem. And referring back to Bridget's figures on medical consultants this morning, one of the reasons why there are people on trolleys is consultants are not doing the rounds and letting people home. So this thing is pervasive, and we've got to address the issue of culture. So what I'm saying is there will be no genuine, transformative, sustainable reform without cultural reform, whether that's in banks and banking regulation. Elderfield has said we are going to change the culture of banking supervision. In the domain of children, in the Catholic Church, you're not going to get the change that's necessary unless you change what David Quinn, a very devout Catholic, called the toxic clerical culture in A&E and in the public service. Now, in the public service, I'm mainly referring to the culture that occupies the senior echelons of the civil service and the public service, and especially that culture insofar as it also includes the relationship with the political system that we became used to in the last decade or so. I want to move on to the character for just a minute. Part of the story that we have to tell ourselves about the last number of years is also a story of characters, either failures of character or evidence of character, individuals. Regling and Watson, no one in a position of authority had the courage to shout stop. That was a character issue. This one, Bishop Jim Moriarty. I failed to question the prevailing culture. And as we go forward, people like Elderfield saying, I need people who think differently, people with competence and probity. Now, one of the things I have to say, and this is true of the church and of the civil service and of FOSS and any of these other organisations and of the banks, they're largely organisations peopled by good people, very good people, but they're trapped in this gel, in this cultural web, which somehow makes it impossible for them to deal with it. And the notion of the contrarian mind has come into vogue in recent times. So I've asked the question, when groupthink and dysfunctional cultures take hold, what choices does a person have? If I'm working there and I see what's going wrong, or I feel I should speak up, what choices do I have? And there's a lot of literature on this. I can take flight. I can get the hell out of the place. I can leave and go elsewhere. Tom O'Higgins, an honourable man who was chair of the Oireachtas Audit Committee, that's the Dáil and the Senate and all that stuff there, he left because he was outraged by the expenses regime that was operating there, which was revealed in all its glory in the Ivor Callally case, for example. So he left. He just could not make progress. Others fight. So they go public, they fight, they rear up, and of course the consequences there. Des O'Malley, Father McGinty and Maynooth, who blew the whistle on Ledwidge, was sent literally to Coventry. Father Hegarty, who spoke out about things 20 years ago, was sent to Erris. Mackerleen, the auditor in one of the banks, and so on. The other one is you join. Prudent silence. You keep the head down, you conform to protect your job, your career, and avoid the hassle. And other one, what I call endure. You just put up with the stress of the contradictions, you get on with doing the best you can, you live with the ambiguity and your sense of powerlessness, and you probably find expression for a lot of the things you believe in outside of work. Now, one of the things, it isn't fair to expect people to make huge personal sacrifices, such as jeopardizing their careers, in order to speak out. And one of the big contributions that's coming right down the tracks now, and I'm sure Robert will have something to say about it, there's a whole raft of reforms that have either happened or are about to happen that will make independent thinking and voicing dissent much less risky. So restoring the Freedom of Information Act, I won't go through all of these, explicit definition of accountabilities and responsibilities, people like Pat Rabbitt and Brendan Howell, a whistleblowers charter, established a senior public service. The referendum regarding the Abilarda case so that you can have Dáil committees asking hard questions. The one I want to stress is at the bottom, and I think there are lessons left to be taken out of what Matthew Elderfield said this morning. HR policies, that's policies which hire people against the values. You can be sure you won't get into the central bank unless you go through the hoops that Elderfield has in place on competence and probity. And he wants to know your track record, which demonstrates probity. And people are going to have to reapply for their jobs as directors and executives in the banks so that you stack up against these criteria. However, systems, protections, rules, FOI, whistleblowers charter, none of this stuff is enough. What matters is character, because you can put in all the rules and regulations you want. For example, we have ethics and standards in public office written down, but Bertie Ahern said the only ethics are the ethics of being re-elected. We had rules and regulations about expenses, but Ivor Callaley could say I did nothing wrong, I did nothing illegal. You could have long established protocols about taking minutes and records of what went on, but you had, I'm making up this quotation, you have people choosing not to keep a written record of what happened on the fateful night of September the 28th. So you can have all the rules you like, you still require the individual character, the individual conscience to come into play. And values that are established in the hearts of minds. There's an article in the recent edition of Studies which says structures and systems may not suffice, there's a need for a moral reawakening. So even with the new reforms, there will be an existential choice for each individual senior civil servant and politician in particular. I now want to come to what you can do, and I'll get through this quickly. How do you reform an embedded culture? What you do is you formalise the core values as suggested by the OECD, you breathe life into them, you report on them, and you have them assured by external scrutiny. So let's have a look. The OECD said governments are now formalising their bodies. They're writing them down. So, for example, I'm going to give you a few here. I've listed 10 on another sheet, which I leave with the record of this speech. The primacy of serving the public good. That's a core value. You heard Sean Fleming illustrate with a dramatic example how that value was violated in the Wicklow County Council area. In relation to the HSE case about the number of children who had died. So what's the opposite of that value? Self-interest, vested interest, protecting the institution. Truth and transparency. I'll comment a bit of these later on. Integrity regarding money, professional competence, accountability. So what you do is you codify the values. And I have a full list here. But what you then do is they don't just go on the wall. They don't go back on the back of your security card. They don't go in the annual report. In the best corporations in the world, they systematically breathe life into the values so that they are salient. They're always present in the room. So you have sustained engagement from top to bottom with all the staff. And I stress this. Now, I met Matthew Elderfield in the bar on Sunday night when I came here. And I introduced myself and I told him that about 7 years ago when the central bank and the regulator were formed, I worked as a consultant there. And I spent quite a bit of time facilitating the articulation of the core values of the central bank and the regulator, and they're all written down. And he said to me, before I could get on with my story, he said, but nothing was done with them. In other words, they're a bloody ornament, sitting there to show people who came along to visit. But what he also told me, he said, I have just finished a restatement of the values, and we will begin the process of rolling them out. So what you do is you codify the values and then you start a sustained engagement. And I told him another story. Having codified the values and being urged to engage with them, I mean quality time at board meetings and senior management meetings, in the phrase that's used, interrogating themselves on whether they're living the values. And somebody who was at one of those meetings at a senior level told me that when it was suggested that they spend some time looking at the values and how they should live up to them, one of the people in that room said, Asher, the values are for the staff. Think of the consequences of that. So you trenchantly test the values. And if you want to look back over the last 10 years, the last 100 days, or you want to make sense or critique what's going on at the present and what's in the pipeline, what you can do is you can take one of the values and ask the questions, but how do they live the values, how do they not live the values, and so on. So the first thing is articulate the values. Secondly, breathe life into them. Thirdly is report on them. Now, there's a whole industry reporting on the financials of a company. There's 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 pages in annual reports on the financials. Now, I'm just making the point, if the culture is so important, and the values are so important, there's not a bloody word other than maybe the word culture. So I'm suggesting that it be a rule or a requirement that all public bodies report annually on the health of their culture. And you can do this. There are instruments and tools and methodologies for doing this that come out of the field of organisation behaviour. And the final one is assurance, because self-scrutiny can often be self-deceit. And to use the Elderfield thing, you need ultimately invasive scrutiny and effective sanctions. So the first 100 days, I'm coming to an end now. Signs of progress and wobbling. So how has the government been doing? There's been a massive comprehensive reform programme being mapped out. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that now. There really is a very impressive programme of reform being mobilised, set out, documented and laid out. Also, the resources are being mobilised at the centre. Robert is assembling groups of people and people with technical expertise who know how to do this stuff in a disciplined way. As to whether or not, what can we see that shows consistency with the values? I'll just give you a couple of examples. And it's for you, rather than me, to meditate on these. In relation to truth and transparency, for example, we have seen the impact of HIQA on truth and transparency. We've seen the example of the children's ombudsman, Ian Elliott. Absolutely no hiding place. So you have a situation, and then Elderfield, listen to him the other day. You know there's going to be truth and transparency in relation to banking. But there's a couple of examples where there's wobbling. I heard on the news the other day that there were allegations of planning irregularities in the Carlow area. And we're told by Minister Hogan that Willie Penrose has decided that it's inappropriate to investigate it, and that the Department of the Environment will investigate it himself. I don't like that. That has a suggestion to me of a little bit of a cover-up. Is that truth and transparency the way we need it? I don't think so. Efficiency, value for money, a tremendous programme coming together and will be rolled out. Responsibility, speaking truth to power, saying what needs to be said to your bosses and to to the government. An editorial in the Irish Times a few weeks ago said the Pensions Board, whose job it is to protect the interests of the stability and integrity of pensions, failed to comment on the government's private levy on private sector pensions, when they should have. Maybe they didn't want to make it embarrassing for the government. So what you can do is you can use a set of values to make sense of what's going on, to interrogate what's going on, and to challenge. So, in conclusion, quoting Gareth Fitzgerald, our economic and financial failures, and also the failures in the public service, were because of a defective value system. And Gareth reminds us of the values we need to think about when we set out on the difficult task of rebuilding. A key action. Governments have found it crucial to restate the traditional and new values and to establish these values in the hearts and minds of people. That's the piece of work to be done. Via a sustained, service-wide programme to embed espoused values. And I would be urging Robert to include that as a specific programme in the programme for reform. There is no single initiative with more transformative potential, and there would be no real reform without cultural reform. The number one critical success factor is political leadership that's committed to fundamental and not superficial reform. And we've got to wait to see that, whether or not that will materialise. Who will provide the air cover for a small number, a critical mass of civil servants who have both the competence and the character to lead the way in transforming the public service. I'm always asked, what do I think myself? Do I think it will happen? Do I think it will happen? Well, I'm optimistic. I really am optimistic. The political signals of intent are strong. We've seen a shifting gears in the way the government There's the end of deference. That's the thing that's coming through in relation to the judiciary, the Catholic Church, in relation to partnership, questioning of that. But I still think, for example, the government is tippy-toeing around some things like the medical consultants that we've seen this morning. I think there's a critical mass of senior officials who are up for it, and I've reason to believe that. There's strong evidence of progress on the reform programme, and I think and I hope that from now on there will be a vigilant public who no longer are going to indulge in deference in regard to all of these things. Thanks very much.